Are you ready to?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
And, I'm Heidi Kosonen, and I'm presenting for the both of us, although we both are present here today. Hold on, it's not so easy this time. Here. All right. We acknowledge that we are on ancestral lands, on Treaty 1 territory, and the heartland of the Métis people. We acknowledge that our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Introducing diversity into the primarily white entertainment business is getting more common with the mainstreaming of social justice movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter. Redressing previous injustices may follow the long-established option of so-called colorblind casting or blind casting, a problematic term denoting deliberately avoiding taking race or ethnicity into account, or so-called color-conscious or inclusive casting, which specifically holds space for BIPOC artists. Each practice has benefits and problems, so we offer instead what we call just casting, focusing here on Indigenous characters and actors in North American mainstream media. We leave aside now Indigenous productions by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, and the situation outside North America. However, we do welcome feedback on all these areas, as this is an excerpt of a work in progress. As with other BIPOC characters, major Indigenous roles in mainstream North American fictional media are too often filled with white actors, which was how blind casting historically worked against fair representation. African American media scholar Kristen J. Warner argues, casting is such a vital practice because casting agents and processes are the gatekeepers for talents, as well as repository for important cultural notions of race, ethnicity, and sexuality. Further, mainstream media suffers from a scarcity of both larger-than-life sidekick and in-depth Indigenous characters, as well as a dearth of characters freed from reiterating colonial stereotypes. We see these exclusions as an issue of mobilizing social justice. We tease out the social implications of Indigenous inclusion by directing our gaze onto media produced by Indigenously co-owned Canadian production company Eagle Vision. Our example is the production of CBC television of the legal drama Burden of Truth for its representation empowering Indigenous and other marginalized groups and demonstrating possibilities for creating impactful TV. Our interview with the Eagle Vision partner and Burden actor Rebecca Gibson gave us valuable insight into the company's processes. Politics of Indigenous representation and casting. As Stephen Combs' contribution to the Frozen Justice video podcast series notes, films have reinforced and challenged cultural stereotypes about Indigenous peoples and colonialism in Canada. Elise Marubio and Eric Buffalohead note that it remains more profitable for Hollywood to continue reproducing the stereotypical images of Native people found in blockbuster period films. Such works have remade period pieces that validate a colonialistic historic memory and deny critical acknowledgement of the lived reality of Native nations. Reflecting the white North American gaze, the characters have ranged between stereotypes, including the noble or ignoble savage, the pronoun-challenged Indian, the savage warrior, the female work drudge, the princess, the sexualized maiden, and the drunken Indian. Privileging the frontier as an imagined site where Native American warriors must be conquered, secured, and surveyed, as Cherokee actor Dalana Studi explains, Indigenous women are relegated to the background. In period pieces, it's all about the men and the warriors. You go to the village and there are no two women, the grandma and the princess. Regardless of how Indigenous women are portrayed, they are sexualized and deemed accessible to the white European men for consumption. Reiterating a paradigmatic understanding of cultural studies, it matters how often and by whom individuals from different backgrounds are represented in the media. Introducing diversity can mean casting characters independent of the actor's ethnicity or skin color. Warner notes that colorblindness emerged as a means of progress that didn't significantly threaten white privilege, and says, "While I am pleased to see people who look like me on television, I also desire these characterizations not be devoid of a socioeconomic and racially historic context. Making roles they see as racially neutral, that is white, forces minority actors to portray characters who are often written as white." Burden of Truth, a legal drama with an inclusive cast. Burden is a Canadian television series aimed at mainstream audiences focused on contemporary Indigenous narratives and featuring Indigenous talents both on and behind the screen. Through 4 seasons, the legal drama follows lawyer Joanna Hanley returning to her roots in small hometown Millwood, shot in Selkirk, Manitoba, and relocating to Winnipeg, both in Treaty 1 territory. In the first season, Joanna leaves Toronto unwillingly to represent a large pharmaceutical company against a group of Millwood girls who have become mysteriously ill with a neurological disorder. She soon changes sides and represents the teens with a local lawyer, Billy Crawford, loving uncle to one of the sick girls, local sports hero Molly Ross. Joanna and Billy gain assistance from Luna Spence, Molly's resourceful girlfriend. Joanna learns of crimes committed by her father, David Hanley, and that Luna is her half-sister. Persistence helped Joanna, Billy, and Luna in their apparently quixotic tilting with the town's industrial and political windmills, but against the odds, and not entirely ethically, the trio wins against Joanna's big city law firm in the case against Matheson Steel. Major Indigenous characters crossing seasons include Luna, who pursues a career in law like her half-sister Joanna, police officer Owen Beckby, who eventually rises in rank to become a chief police and fight corruption in Millwood's justice and political systems, and Luna's single mother, Geraldine Spence, who battles to do right by her daughter. All Indigenous roles are played by Indigenous actors, some of whom had had little previous background. Burden features minority characters from its Chinese, Dutch, Canadian leading actor Kroik to those from the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. Season 2's double plot involves privacy activist Noah Achari, as well as charges against Luna for her father's murder. Season 3 features single mother Cody Chartrand, who helped Joanna in her youth and receives help in return when her children are apprehended by Millwood Family Services. Season 4 follows Owen and Taylor Matheson trying to help Indigenous youth Kip and Dee involved in a trafficking case. And there are BIPOC clients, family members, legal assistants, and community members too. Ecovision's Rebecca Gibson expresses, "One of the big excuses that our industry uses for not including diverse people is that they aren't experienced. But that has never been a barrier to us. My area of expertise has always been finding actors that you wouldn't typically find." Her strategies include free classes and actor support groups. Ecovision's investment in undiscovered talents directly relates to their aims of creating content that creates change, fostering justice. They work to ensure that the actors on the screen, as well as workers behind the scenes, reflect Canadian social and cultural diversity and the historical and current significance of Indigenous people and their perspectives. But their ability to do so doesn't come without a fight. Gibson describes in this review that if you don't have white characters, then white people don't watch it. And I used to hear this too for women. Oh, you can't have a woman as the lead because then men won't watch it. And I know that everything comes down to dollars and power which are interchangeable, but that's changing so fast that it's remarkable to see just how easy it is. Don't just cast white people and have people who are writers and directors who are not white and producers who are not white, and then you'll have diversity in front of the camera too. As Gibson describes, the fight for not only an inclusive cast, but also a diverse team of writers and directors succeeded despite challenges. By season 3, Burden had 3 Indigenous writers in the room. As she intimates, diversity in front of the camera ensues from diversity behind the screen. Indigenous talents in writing and directing include Ojipe Salto, Madison Thomas, writing in season 1 and directing in season 4. Burden is notable for creating roles differing from colonial stereotypes appointed for Indigenous women in North America. Even when addressing topics such as trafficking and violence, Burden doesn't resort to sexualization or passivization, but instead represents Indigenous women as in-depth figures with agency. Further challenging the white male colonial gaze and imagination, Luna, the most central Indigenous character featured in all 4 seasons, is lesbian, and both Cheryl and Cody are single parents. Joanna, their relative, friend, and helper, as Asian Canadian, similarly challenges the colonial Orientalist imagination of submissive women. Too often, female characters on screen are saved by white males. In contrast, Billy is a friend, relative, helper, not unlike Joanna. In Police Officer Owen, the series' major Indigenous male character, Burden again deviates from the North American entertainment's representations. Defying Rhonda Harris Taylor's notion of the historical stereotype of the Indigenous male as the savage, faithful sidekick to the white protagonist, Owen is not subordinated dramatically to any of the series' white males. Indeed, he succeeds his former boss and assailant as police chief. Further, he is one of the most stable and paternal characters. He is Luna's favorite of all her past stepfathers, doesn't hesitate to assist Indigenous youth struggling due to their marginalized status, and reveals and combats racism in Millwood, even when faced with verbal and physical threats. Burden neither erases indigeneity nor overlooks Indigenous people's struggles in white colonial Canadian society. It also addresses justice with significant Indigenous themes. The focus on indigeneity increases after the first season, where it is partially sublimated to ecological and familial conflicts. Thematically, Burden closely studies the conflicts between individuals from varied backgrounds and institutions as they are trying to navigate between doing the right thing and taking the easy way out. Affected by past injustices and restricted by societal pressures and class ceilings. The difficulty for moral action is manifested in Joanna's personal battle, as she is forced to face the complicity in crimes done by her father and her prestigious Toronto law firm. At the end of the season 1, she rejects her father's legacy of exploiting others. She marks the move by taking her Chinese mother's surname and becoming Joanna Chang. The complexities of ethics and justice are revealed in Indigenous characters' life. The series addresses flaws in colonial Canadian justice system itself, from corrupt police to racist judges and underrepresented juries, which render Indigenous peoples vulnerable. Characters struggle with imposed, too often impossible conflicts created by their marginalized position in the society and justice system. As with blind casting, the law's self-conscious blindfolds support white supremacy, refusing to admit that the playing field is not level. Simply asserting that all individuals are equal within a system doesn't make them so. As Joanna's high school friend Cody comments, it is easy to follow the law when it isn't constantly trying to crush you. Burden's commendable representations offer examples of not of ignoring race and indigeneity, but of holistically improving access. In an extensively white, cis, heterosexual, male-dominated entertainment business, individuals outside hegemonic positions have difficulty accessing the systems of production. Mainstream creators remain free to construct images of a variety of groups to which they do not belong in any way they like and reach a large viewing audience in the process. In contrast, Burden exemplifies Canadian media productions allowing for cultural spaces for resisting everyday assumptions about crime and justice. Our approach is guided by a focus on questions of just representation and participation. We believe media creators need a nuanced understanding of how their productions affect viewers and society at large. They need knowledge on how media representation modes and types from fiction to documentary may influence their effectiveness to foster social justice and well-being. While justice's full meaning is unknowable, just casting proceeds from a judicious sense of the importance of representation, from the inclusion of BIPOC behind the scenes, and by trusting the judgments of marginalized peoples about what is and isn't appropriate. Acknowledge colonialism and power imbalances, not only in the society, but also in media practices. And the results, like Burden, can be entertaining, thought-provoking, and widely popular. And thank you. Here are our references and cast for Burden of Truth. And we thank for the funding SSHRC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that. We will move on to our third panelist now. Meg Lonergan, are you ready to go? Great.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sounds great. Looks great.
Excellent. So hello everyone. I'm speaking to you today from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory. My name is Meg Lonergan and I'm excited to present my forum piece that was published in 2020 as part of the Porn Studies special issue on tourism. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in legal studies in the collaborative specialization program with political economy. My doctoral research critically examines obscenity law in Canada following the Supreme Court decision in Butler in 1992 to present day. I'm particularly interested in the criminalization of fictional obscenity, so hopefully this provides some context for this brief paper, and I welcome questions or feedback during the discussion. So without further ado, Hard On of Darkness, gore and shock websites as the dark tourism of digital space. To quote Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness, he hated all this and somehow he couldn't get away. The Hard On of Darkness from the title is a reference to the deep, dark journey of Heart of Darkness, the feeling of being drawn in deeper to depravity, which matches the popular rhetoric about people who watch pornography or shocking violence, especially in the digital context, and how it is presumed to lead to consuming darker content and eventually acting out based on the subject matter viewed. To quote tourism researchers Philip Stone and Richard Sharpley from their article about dark tourism, quote, travel to and experiences of places associated with death is not a new phenomenon. People have long been drawn, purposely and otherwise, towards sites, attractions, or events linked in one way or another with death, suffering, violence, or disaster. Dark tourism explores the relationship between seeing, experiencing, and learning as it pertains to dark sites. Dark tourist sites are associated with crime, death, murder, and violence. People who visit Holocaust and penal museums want to learn, to see, and to understand the histories of violence and oppression tied to those places and spaces. The affective power of dark tourist sites makes learning about unsettling and disturbing content effective, as illustrated in recent criminological research and tourist literature. Despite popular discourses referring to violent films and other content as torture porn and to photographs of the developing world and war zones as poverty and war porn respectively, little research has been conducted on the websites devoted to shocking and violent content. This article addresses the legal and ethical possibilities of researching the shock pornographies described by Jones and Malabakis in 2009, and applies a dark tourism framework to gore and other shock websites and videos from my position as a porn and horror studies scholar. I expand on the components of dark tourism to illustrate how this is a productive frame for understanding how people engage with shock and gore websites. Engaging with ongoing research about violent digital media, I illustrate how combining tourism with porn and horror studies illuminates their similarities regarding access, anonymity, exploitation, exploration, and sexuality. Consuming shock and gore websites is an exercise in dark tourism. Like tourism more generally, dark tourism has had a long and complicated relationship with anthropology and ethnography. Researchers and tourists alike have sought out the dark and disturbing places around the world. In the contemporary digital era, that exploration has moved online, that exploration has moved online to the navigation of digital space. Shock and gore websites, like the mysteries of the dark web are understood as dark and scary places of the unknown, and are both relatively taboo and not well understood by the general public, which I've really had hammered home. I've been teaching law in the Information Society for a couple of years now, and I've started teaching how the internet actually works, including the layers of the internet, such as the dark web, deep web, and surface web, to try and combat some of the mythos around, the deep, dark, scary dark net. Digital tourism has been defined as digital innovations for or for the support of a tourist experience in the conventional sense of a physical space in an embodied way. Cybertourism has been described as the electronic substitution for a physical experience that overcomes the barriers, such as physical or monetary, to having that experience in the so-called real world. There is a dearth of research that thinks about websites themselves as spaces and places that people visit and explore. There's a lack of research where websites are understood as akin to destinations in the analog world. This conceptualization of websites as places that people visit and as dark tourist sites is productive for understanding how and why people interact with them. For instance, Steve Jones notes in his reflections on Two Girls, One Cup, part of the draw of such shocking videos is the pleasure of positioning oneself with the normative majority and of experiencing the strange from a safe distance. The ability to experience something different for a short period of time and then return to normal life is at the very heart of tourism, and thus is indeed a racialized, classed, and gendered experience of both digital and traditional tourism. The film genres of horror and pornography are characterized by their representation of bodies, bodily fluids, and taboo acts. These acts are defined as that which is clearly visible, not hidden, disguised, or implied. Previously, I've used the term explicit media to refer to horror and pornography, encompassing material that is sexual and/or violent in its depictions. Explicit media differs from graphic media, which is used by police to refer to child pornography, and the moralism of hardcore, extreme, or torture porn. Explicit media emphasizes what is seen, felt, and interpreted by the audience. It is critical that fictional representations be treated differently than actual recordings of crimes, like sexual assault and murder. However, the term is conceptually inclusive of both real and seemingly real, largely because many legal frameworks, such as those in Canada and the UK, make no distinction between real and seemingly real depictions of extreme violence. In his recent article, Jeffrey Potushin argues that the digital has entered all aspects of the collective conscious, and that it seems, quote, we can never get enough as consumers in the age of digital social media. Where porn was once sought out in specialized shops, theaters, or ordered via the mail, quote, the traditional pornographic print and video industry has been successfully challenged by producing and sharing their own images and films for free on a myriad of websites, end quote. What is shared includes suicides and murders being streamed in real time or recorded to later be streamed on websites specializing in presenting audiences with depictions of extreme real violence and death from around the world. When I refer to shock and gore websites, or rather the dark content of dark tourism of digital space, I'm referring to what Susanna Kosonen describes as websites that are, quote, about images and acts that are deemed extreme or even abject. They are about the images that are pornographic, obscene, and offensive, including bodily waste, bestiality, and elaborate displays of BDSM, end quote. As Steve Jones notes, such content is often hard to neatly distinguish as clearly either horror or pornography. So the background image of this slide is an image by Montreal special effects artist Remy Couture, who was acquitted in 2012 by a jury on obscenity charges. And his case is one of the analytical sites of my doctoral work. And he continues to produce content that would be considered as blurring the lines between horror and porn. So it is well known that both horror and pornographic films have historically been marginalized within film studies and the legal apparatus as neither art nor expression, but as cheaply produced content for maximizing profits or being too explicit as quote-unquote body genres per Linda Williams's terminology. The body is what we see in porn and in horror. The body in literal pieces or framed to focus on a particular body part, the body expelling bodily fluids, whether that be blood or vomit, ejaculate, sweat, or tears. These two are the genres that seek to affect the viewer's body the most, whether the aim is to arouse the audience or scare the audience or something in between. There is an intimacy and vulnerability in watching body genres, and that intimacy and vulnerability is just as evident whether they are consumed for pleasure or research, or the unspoken space in between those motivations. As Tara Summer notes, quote, pornography use often remains a chilled topic of discussion, typically perceived as taboo and deviant, particularly for violent pornography, end quote. And further, she notes that men are not only assumed to be more frequent viewers of such content, but that when women are viewers, that they're then assumed to be co-viewing with a male partner at his request. The imagined communities of people watching and exploring these shocking gore websites is highly gendered as male, as are the consumers of mainstream porn and sex tourists, more broadly speaking. This imagined community is rooted in the belief that men watch porn, porn degrades women and/or promotes violence against women, and exposure to pornographic content drives male viewers to look for more extreme content over time. Jones and Melibelkis note that researchers are not and should not be thought of as devoid of their own sexuality. It would be dishonest to try to claim that I'm not affected by the materials I watch for research. However, I'm also affected by the materials I watch in my leisure time. And it would be further dishonest to claim that there is always a strict divide between these categories. To be engaged in the world is to be moved and affected by encounters with the world. Exploring dark tourist sites is not just experienced by its consumers, but also presents an avenue for researchers to understand consumers of dark tourism by experiencing and viewing the content as well as analyzing it. This knowledge aids in building narratives to better understand our world, both online and offline. However, the ethics of participating in dark tourism of such digital spaces remains crucial. As Kosonen argues, quote, it is impulse and affect over thinking and consideration of the longer-term implications and consequences of our actions, end quote. While dark tourists of sites hosting gory, shocking, and otherwise explicit material may be drawn in by the spectacle of extreme depictions of violence, it is important that people reflect not only on the potential effects of consuming such content, but on the ethical and legal implications of further sharing such content, and of potentially exploiting those depicted in it. For example, a family in Northern Ireland has spoken out after gruesome footage of the multi-car accident that killed their daughter was immediately uploaded and shared across social media platforms. This sparked conversation about the blurry, but I argue, important distinction between violent and sexual content, because this case is beyond the scope of recent legislation in the jurisdiction to address image-based sexual violence, as it is not sexual in nature. As researchers and dark tourists of explicit media online, it is critical that we not only take data and learn from such bases, but also give back by ensuring our ability to access materials and expression is protected. But so are the rights of contributors, content creators, and other tourists on their own paths. How we balance the rights of those consuming and distributing and researching such content with those depicted in it, and how we draw those ethical lines will be the focus of future research. And we can talk about that later if people are interested. Thank you.
Oh, great, thank you so much. A really interesting panel. Okay, so thank you to everybody for these really great, really interesting presentations. We can move on to the question period. Just a reminder, you can use the Q&A feature of Zoom, or if that doesn't work, you can use the chat function as well, and I can read out the questions as they come in. And let us know who the question is for as well. Okay, so this is for Meg. Can you please elaborate more on the concepts of torture porn and body horror, and perhaps limits you see with those concepts? That's in the question and answer there.
Yeah, for sure. So torture porn was used by a film journalist in the early 2000s to bemoan the number of financially successful horror films that were coming out. So this is when Saw and Hostel, for instance, were beginning their franchises and making a lot of money. And for people who are familiar with horror movies, there are cycles where new sort of horror movies will come out all at once and people will bemoan how these are terrible movies, but the movies they grew up with were great. And this actually can go back to the start of film, where like people will defend classic 80s horror as being like legitimate horror, but like new horror is too graphic. But you go back to the 80s and people were criticizing the 80s and being like, oh, the 60s were real horror, this is terrible. So it gained a lot of cultural currency, but is sort of like an empty signifier. Like people throw torture porn around to mean both mainstream films like Horror and Hostel, but also to refer to the Abu Ghraib photos, to Luca Magnotta's video. Like it's thrown around to encompass sort of everything, and so means nothing. And it's definitely like a morally loaded term. So people describe this content as torture porn or as hardcore or as extreme, and those are all sort of subjective adjectives that also are mobilized by people who are horror fans or produce this content because that gets a lot of attention, but also are used by critics to sort of shame and bemoan content, sort of regardless of what the actual content is. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I have a question for Heidi and Pauline. Do you plan to do any research on audiences, for example, looking at online fan discussions of burden of proof, to assess how audiences read and react to just casting and the anti-colonial decolonizing representation of characters on the program?
And the answer would be yes, we do. There are very enthusiastic online fan groups. There's Facebook groups and people who participate quite extensively in a lot of the productions that Eagle Vision put together. And we are certainly, at least initially, will just be looking at what they say, but it does look like, as a general rule, I mean, maybe this is not true for all kind of fan reactions, but the responses are very, very positive, very, very warm. And there's a real sense of community, and actually the folks that we've talked to at Eagle Vision have talked about that as well, that there's a strong fan community. Heidi, anything to add?
Not really. I thought that was wide.
Okay, I have another question here for Dale. Dale, are there any recommendations for public transportation policies, like how they can aid homeless men, for instance?
Well, okay, so I guess I'm going to answer this in two ways. One is the broader policy implication, echoing people like Nick Scott and various others, is a complete radical disassemblage of the current system that's completely oriented towards automobility and its ways of, hollowing out the downtown core and preventing movements of people that are undesirable to those areas, and then creating forms of mobility that have for access for all. But in the immediate, I think a general starting point would be to give access, or free access, which wouldn't actually cost cities all that much, to provide bus passes and train passes, in the case of Chicago, to homeless men, so that they could actually get to work in ways that are efficient and don't take out a humongous chunk out of their already meager paychecks. And so that would, I'm saying in the immediate, we're thinking the latter, but in the long term, I don't think that we need to accept the current governed mobility regime, and we need to radically kind of challenge the way in which it's assembled in ways that only proffer a very small amount of the population, the elites, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. I'll just mention for those who may be watching this recorded later, Megan has put in the chat that Steve Jones has an excellent book, Torture Porn, Horror After Saw, from 2013, where he traces the history of that term specifically. So that's helpful if you're looking for more information on that term. Thank you for that. Any other questions from the audience? I'll just jump in and ask a question. Feel free to ask another one though. This is for Heidi and Pauline as well. I'm just wondering if there is a difference in what we see for just casting because CBC was involved in the production of that particular show, because it's more of a public broadcaster than an independent for-profit broadcaster, if that's where we're going to see more just casting than in other areas?
Well, I think that there are other TV stations as well who are clearly looking for particular demographics. And so, I mean, APTN is a very good example that includes all kinds of materials. And Eagle Vision has done lots of productions for APTN as well. I think that the CBC and the CBC based in Ontario is, in some ways a bit of a double-edged sword. And I don't really want to talk so much about burden, but I think about the reaction to oh gosh, that recent series, the Supernatural one, and it's completely the Eden Robinson books, Trickster. And I mean, I hate to say it, but it's not entirely coincidental that the director of that series was attacked, and attacked specifically for the sufficiency of her Indigenous identification. And, even in the end, that very popular series was shut down, just completely shut down, primarily, we presume, because of that kind of questioning. And it was the CBC questioning the CBC. And, it's hard not to go to a little conspiracy place on that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think public broadcasters have a responsibility, but actually private broadcasters also have legal responsibilities to be inclusive. And having looked at television programs pretty much across the world, and certainly doing comparisons with American and Canadian TV in other contexts, I certainly see a lot more inclusive casting and a lot more, I want to say, nods towards what I would now call just casting in Canadian productions generally. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. And actually, we would strongly recommend the book that Heidi talked about, Kristen J. Warner's book on colorblind casting. She talks about the whole process. We'll put that in the chat too. Thank you. Heidi, anything to add there?
Well, I think this was about broadcasting, but I don't think we can really undermine the kind of independent media producers, which are like feministically attached and kind of devoted to social justice agendas, who produce those programs. And they, yeah, we cannot undermine those.
Okay, thank you so much. And so the book is Kristen J. Warner, Colorblind Casting. If anyone wants to check that out. Well, we're at the end of the panel here. Just want to say thank you so much to our panelists and to our audience for attending. I really enjoyed listening to these presentations and all of the presentations today. I believe that concludes our conference presentations for today, but please join us back again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for some more. Thank you.
And also, Dr. Cohn put in the chat, and you've received an email from Janae about a social event around 5 o'clock tonight. So, you know, if you feel like popping in, having a chat, that would be great. If not, we'll see you all tomorrow morning.
I'd like to send on a thank you to the organizers. This was wonderful. You guys have done such a phenomenal job.
Thanks, Dale. I appreciate that. Thanks to Janae in particular. All right. We'll see you all hopefully tonight. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.